Captain Walton groaned. The men were yelling. Why were the men yelling? He had been up for nearly 40 hours straight, and had just closed his eyes. The only thing he wanted to do was keep them closed. Why were the men yelling? The captain breathed deeply, stood from his cot, and threw on his coat. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and lumbered up to the deck. The midnight winds of the Arctic stung his eyes as he found his way to the edge of the ship, where his whole crew was playing a man aboard. Then, the sleep dropped from his eyes like a weight. Pulling a man aboard? They were days, hundreds of miles from anywhere, sailing in the Arctic Sea. How were they pulling a man aboard? He rushed to help his crewmen. He looked down at the man fighting in vain against the sailors. He didn't want to be saved. He raved about needing to carry on his journey, needing to see his final task through to the end. The captain grimaced. The man wasn't going anywhere. Not only because his dog sled was marooned on a piece of ice, drifting in the sea, but because the captain could see, even from that distance in the dark, that all but one of the dogs were frozen, and the man himself couldn't move his legs. The crew of the ship, set to be the first one to discover a passage through the North Pole and into the Pacific, was undeterred by one incapacitated madman. They scooped him up, and his little dog too, and carried him aboard. It was only after he locked eyes with the captain and learned that they were crazy enough to be sailing north that he stopped fighting the sailors. The moment he calmed down, he passed out, and he stayed like that for 2 days. Captain Walton couldn't go back to sleep after that, because that dog sled, the one marooned after the ice had broken up just after sundown, was the second one that he had seen in as many days. Earlier, they had seen a man gliding across the snow, led by a sled of his own, but he couldn't have been a man. He must have been 8 feet tall, a tattered black cloak trailing behind him. He passed so quickly that they thought it was an illusion, but now, finding a second man so far out in the sea, he didn't know what was going on. Captain Walton could have gone to bed, because the stranger, as I said, didn't wake for 2 more days, and didn't talk for nearly 5. When he did, Walton, who had no interest beyond his ambitions, found his first friend in years. Unfortunately, the man was going to die. At least, that's what he insisted on. He said he had one more task before him. Then, he could rest. He talked for days, as the ship sailed farther north. And finally, Captain Walton learned the man's name. The stranger told the captain to get some pens and papers. Victor Frankenstein began his story. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. Victor's carriage jostled on the road, but he hardly felt it. It felt wrong to leave for college so soon after his mother. His mother. He couldn't think about her without pain mixed with nausea coursing through him. He began the summer with his whole life ahead of him, and the summer ended with him a changed man, leaving everyone behind in Geneva to pick up the pieces. Elizabeth had gotten it first, the scarlet fever. It was the beginning of summer, and it started with her just feeling faint. Then, one day, she collapsed. Elizabeth was Victor's adopted sister. When he was young, he traveled with his parents all around Europe. Once, when Victor was 5, they were helping out and feeding the poor in Milan. They found a sad woman with too many children and not enough food. The youngest, Elizabeth, was Victor's age and wasn't even the woman's daughter. She was an orphan. Her father, like the priest, Faria from the Count of Monte Cristo, was a revolutionary. And like Faria, no one really knew what happened to him. Elizabeth continued on with a family friend until she found her family, Victor's family. They adopted the beautiful young girl, and their family grew. Their family grew again when they had Victor's younger brother, and again when they had William. With 4 children, they gave up the nomadic life, and they settled in Geneva, Switzerland. And that's where, until he was 17, Victor lived. He had a happy life, and there, he met someone who would be a lifelong friend, Henry Clerval. It was there that he had passed a happy childhood, and it was there when, after he turned 17, Victor's mother died. She had been by Elizabeth's bedside day and night, holding the girl's hand, weeping for her, praying for her. It was to her joy when the fever started to abate, and Elizabeth started to recover. It was to everyone's horror when the mother became sick. She descended faster than Elizabeth, and she didn't recover. She died calmly, resigning herself to death, and speaking of hopes of meeting her children in another world. Her absence was felt throughout the family. She left a hole. The school year had already started in Ingolstadt, the location of Victor's university. He missed the first few weeks, and though they allowed him some time, they would only allow him so much. Eventually, he had to leave. They all had things they needed to get on with. Victor with his studies, his father, Alphonse Frankenstein, with his work, and Elizabeth with caring for the children. It was only after Victor was on the road, and away from it all, that he finally felt it. Unmoored from the life he had known in Geneva, where he had been surrounded by people who loved him, he felt exposed. He would never see his mother again. He would go home and she wouldn't be there. He wouldn't hear her voice. She would never embrace him. She was gone. He was also perplexed by something his mother had said. She had told Victor and Elizabeth, quote, "My firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father." They both knew what it meant. Victor thought Elizabeth would write it off as the last rantings of a woman stricken with fever, but she didn't. Neither of them did. They didn't talk about it, but they didn't laugh at it. It hung in the air between them. And for the first time, Victor saw Elizabeth as more than an adopted sister. The trip to Ingolstadt was exhausting, and the whole time, Victor worried about the world outside his town. He wondered if he was even ready for college. It wasn't helpful that the first professor he talked to, Professor Krempe, laughed at the books he had been reading growing up, telling him every bit of his scientific education up to that point had been shown to be little more than trite superstition. He was living in the age of enlightenment, yet he read from quote-unquote scientists from the ancient medieval world, people who still believed in alchemy. He gave Victor a pile of books to begin the study of natural philosophy immediately. Victor had grown up on a sparse, outdated library in a small hamlet. Nobody had told him that the works of those ancients had been completely invalidated, and, as such, he absolutely devoured them as a kid. These scientists were heroes. They were conquerors. When he dug into Professor Krempe's syllabus, he was simultaneously amazed with how far humans had come, but disgusted by what scientists had turned into. They weren't like the gods of old, like Prometheus, bringing light into a world of ignorance, shaping the world with their grand ideas. Scientists today were content to mine away in their own little tunnels, hyper-specialized, believing that just because you thought you knew something was impossible, it must be so. And they only moved human knowledge forward by inches in their lifetime. The ancients believed in the impossible with hopes that they might achieve it. The modern man believed everything to be impossible and achieved nothing. For a long time, Victor Frankenstein believed that all of his work, all of his foundation, had been worthless. He began to grow sick with the idea of joining a field where he would spend his life on nothing. Little by little, though, he found professors who shared his passion for the way things should be. He found Professor Waldman, who introduced him to chemistry and mathematics. He saw the bounds he could take in those burgeoning branches of science in his lifetime, and his hopes were renewed. Now, he only needed a goal. It flashed in his mind, only for an instant, but an instant was long enough. The face of his mother. How he and Elizabeth had watched the life fade from her eyes. He thought about it. The difference between life and death. How thin the line was. Death was like a disease. The greatest disease that humanity had faced, that everyone would face. But diseases could be cured. He could pour a torrent of light into this dark world. His mind moved quickly. First, he would learn to reanimate lifeless matter. A new species would bless him as creator. Then he, Victor Frankenstein, would discover the secret to keeping people alive and taking back bodies from death. When Victor was young, he had been standing in the doorway during a lightning storm. They were the type that could arrive in an instant in Switzerland, and Victor and Elizabeth had just run inside. She was already finding blankets and towels, but something told Victor to turn around. Something told him to look at the tree. As his eyes found it, the lightning snaked down from the sky, and sparks and flame flew out from the tree that had been older than the country where it put down roots. He watched it burn, and then, in the morning, he saw the raw power of electricity. Memory of that event had surfaced quickly after he made his decision to cure death. He knew it was his mind connecting the dots for him. Still, even with the end in mind, he had so far to go. He had so much to learn. He wasn't a medical student, and dissections were hard to come by. Even then, he wouldn't be allowed the kind of close inspection he needed. He would be one of a crowd of students clamoring for a glance. He needed more than that. He needed to go down to the catacombs. An extensive system of catacombs ran underneath Ingolstadt, and for the first few weeks, Victor studied the entrances and learned the comings and goings. After a month, he stole out into the darkness himself, armed with only a lamp and a notebook. He started back, far back, with the people who had been dead for decades. He learned the human bone structure and tracked the course of decay. Then, he worked his way up. He surreptitiously marked the graves with the number of weeks and watched how they rotted and became food for worms. He devised and tested several different ways to preserve the body from rot, to keep them from decay. Then, he attempted his first dissection. He was surprised how easy it was to cut into a cadaver, to learn how the different muscles connected to the different bones, to study the cartilage and tendons and teeth. He made notes on everything. Then, one day, when he didn't even need his notebook anymore to know how the human body was constructed, he was ready. The formula he devised to keep things from decay was invaluable. He wouldn't be able to do it all at once. And when it came to meat, you were working against the clock. When he realized the scope of his project, he moved to a dusty old top-floor apartment on the outskirts of Ingolstadt, one where the ground floor was perennially empty. At night, he stole out to the crypts, or to the butcher. It was an idea he had underground. What if he didn't just make a human, but he made a human better? A human with the muscles of an ox, with different skin, able to withstand cold and heat better, one that needed comparatively little food. He used the money that was supposed to be going toward his books, food, and studies, and used to buy whole legs of meat, taking only the muscles and casting the rest away. For the finer things, he would still raid the fresh bodies in the crypt, and providing people didn't die a violent death, most of it would be usable. He would spend all day and all night in his dusty apartment, meticulously knitting muscles and bone and skin. While he built a body, his own body deteriorated. He became pale and thin. Working for such long hours in the dark, he became weak. And trying to keep his head above water with his actual studies, he almost never slept. Still, a bit of sacrifice in his youth was nothing compared to the glory that awaited him on the other side. The brain and the eyes. He knew they were organs, like any other, but somehow, they felt the most human, the most consequential. In the end, Victor didn't know who they came from. He didn't want to know who they came from. If his science was right, it wouldn't matter. The person, the creature, would be like a blank slate. If memories existed in the brain, they would be wiped out. He waited with a leather bag full of a solution to preserve those two precious organs from any rot whatsoever. He entered the tombs at nightfall and emerged hours later, the final two pieces of his puzzle in hand. It was another few weeks of connecting various nerves, capillaries, veins, arteries, and the like. He hadn't noticed the months pass by. The summers fade into winters, and winters pass into summers. For 2 years he had worked until, one night, on a frigid November, he looked down at his creation and took a deep breath. He was ready. We don't really know how Frankenstein infused his creature with life. Given the prominence of the memory of the power of the lightning bolt, we can kind of infer that lightning played some role. Still, we don't know. Frankenstein refused to tell Captain Walton, wanting the secret to die with him. So we don't know what led to those yellow eyes opening. to that heart beating once again. But they did. Frankenstein stood over his creation and smiled. And then something happened. Something terrible. Its limbs started convulsing. Frankenstein staggered back and stared out in horror at the skin that barely covered the muscles and veins. The yellow, watery eyes and those thin, black lips. He had brought it to life. And now the creature was having a seizure on the table. Frankenstein gritted his teeth and narrowed his eyes. This thing was his creation. His responsibility. It had just been indecorously dragged into our world by a creator that never considered the consequences of bringing it to life. Frankenstein knew what he should do. What was the right thing to do. And Victor Frankenstein did the exact opposite. Frankenstein ran from the room screaming and slammed the door behind him. He had started the whole process at 1 a.m, and when you work from home on stuff you're really passionate about, the hours seem to run together. Staggering out at 4 a.m, with 2 years of work dying on the table behind him, Victor barely made it to his bed before he passed out from exhaustion. He had terrible dreams. He dreamed of his mother, dying in his arms, Elizabeth coming to visit him in Ingolstadt, him taking her hands and kissing her like he had longed to do over the past 2 years. But then he opened his eyes and immediately watched her go through all the stages of decomposition instantly. A shroud enveloped her. And then the worms came. His eyes snapped open with a start, wind rattling his shutters, and his forehead was covered in a cold sweat. He rolled over and saw the eyes. It was alive. Those watery yellow eyes were looking down at him. Its grotesque mouth curled into a smile. It started to try to mouth words or something to Victor. Panic flooded Victor's mind. It was alive and standing over him. He looked on the thing's strong limbs, an imposing 8-foot-tall stature, and knew that he had made a horrible mistake. He hadn't created a new race of beautiful creatures that would usher humanity into a deathless tomorrow. He was a 19-year-old who had haphazardly given life to a corpse, and now that corpse was staring back at him. He screamed in the creature's face and, while it was temporarily paralyzed by confusion, pushed past it and out the door. Victor watched the sunrise over the apartment that towered over the courtyard, less than a block away. It was freezing, but he didn't feel it as he paced. What had he done? He had created a monster. Why didn't he stop to think that creating something 2.5 feet taller than him, with several times his strength, might be a bad thing? When the sun was finally up and people were starting to move around the town, Victor took one step toward his apartment, and then spun around and took the next step in the complete opposite direction. He just couldn't. He couldn't go back there. He couldn't look at that thing. Soaked and shivering from the rain that had stopped just before dawn, Victor staggered through town, sure that he would hear the shouts of the townspeople, or turn and see those yellow eyes staring back at him from a dark alley. It was when he was lost in thought, standing in front of an inn, that he was almost run over by a carriage. It came to a stop next to him, and when the door opened, he saw a familiar face. It was Henry Clerval, his childhood friend from back home. Victor could hardly speak, he was so confused. He knew Henry's father didn't value education at all. He thought it was a waste of time for Henry to go to school when he could be out making money. Besides, the father hadn't gone to college, and he turned out all right. Victor would learn that it had taken 2 years of convincing, but finally, Henry managed to wear him down. When his father asked him where he wanted to go, Henry knew there was only one place for him, the school of his best friend. He boarded the next carriage for Ingolstadt. It was when the joy of the reunion passed that Henry looked on his old friend and began to worry. Victor didn't look well. He was soaked, pale, and skinny with deep, dark rings underneath his eyes. As they walked, Victor asked about his family. and Henry told him that his father, Elizabeth, and brothers were doing well. But they would have liked to hear from Victor more, like, at all. Victor nodded. He told Henry that he had been busy, but that was all over. His hand came to a rest on something. He looked up in horror. He had mindlessly taken Henry back to his apartment. He pulled his hand back from the door, and Henry looked up, asking if this was where Victor lived. Victor said yes, but they couldn't go in there. Henry narrowed his eyes. No, but they definitely needed to go in there. Victor didn't look well, and at the very least, he needed a change of clothes. Victor nodded, looked at his friend, smiled, and rushed inside the door, slamming it behind him. Henry heard the lock, and then Victor's feet pounding up the stairs. He was wondering just how much college had changed his friend when he heard laughing from the upstairs. It started as a chuckle, but it morphed into a wild, uncontrolled, maniacal thing. The laugh descended the stairs, and then Henry heard the lock turn. Victor was laughing just inside the door, and Henry was just about to ask him what was wrong when the young man collapsed on the floor right in front of him. He picked Victor up and ascended the stairs to Victor's empty top-floor apartment. Victor awoke with a headache and heard footsteps rushing toward him. It was Henry, bringing him some water. He looked around his apartment. It was clean. It wasn't even clean when he moved in. He gasped and looked to his lab, but it, too, was well lit. The table was pushed to the side, and there was now a bed in there. Victor threw off the covers. Why was it so hot in here when there wasn't even a fire in the fireplace? It was November. Henry gave him a look. Well, no, it wasn't. It was August. Victor sat up. He had been out for 9 months? Henry shrugged. Yep. Victor said the last thing he remembered was talking to Henry about the man, fulfilling his dream to enter the university, or something. Henry pursed his lips. Yeah, he didn't. If your friend is sick, you take care of him. Victor would have done the same. He moved into the other room so he could keep an eye on Victor. Didn't really use the table, though. There was a lot of blood on that table when he first arrived. Henry just assumed it was, college science stuff. Victor froze. Yes, college science stuff. He asked if Henry had seen anything else that was weird. Henry shook his head. Did Victor mean other than his childhood friend having a breakdown and passing out for 9 months while he scrubbed blood and what he could only guess were bits of arteries from the cracks in the floorboards? No, nothing weird. It took Victor a few more weeks, but his strength returned to him. It was good to have a friend, too, and he began to think about what happened last year, what had been happening for the past 2 years, as a nightmare that he had just woken up from. The day was breaking, and he could breathe again. Unfortunately, that lasted until just the next year, when he went to introduce Henry to the professors at the university. Henry claimed he only wanted to study Eastern languages, but Victor knew just how little Henry's father had exposed him to. It was when Victor introduced Henry to Dr. Krempe that Victor got one look at the various test tubes and scientific instruments. It triggered another attack, and Henry barely got Victor back to the apartment in time for him to collapse. It didn't last so long this time, but Victor and Henry both knew that Victor needed a change. Just the thought of studying any of the sciences brought Henry back to the days in the crypts, to watching the bodies decompose, to harvesting organs. Things that should have disgusted him then, they paralyzed him now. It was only after he switched to Eastern languages, Henry's field of study, that he found some measure of peace. Still, the university disgusted him, and over the 2 years he studied alongside Henry, he found first their apartment, then the university, then the entire town of Ingolstadt disquieting. He knew the thing he had made, his creature, was likely dead. It had wandered out at the start of a German winter, with likely no idea who or what it was. Everything that lived died, and his abomination, no matter how horrifying, was no exception. Still, the city reminded him of the sins he had committed against God and nature. The whole time, he had been writing Elizabeth. She was the only bright spot in his life, and he resolved to go to her, to return to his home, to Geneva. He would figure out his life, but he was a smart, driven 23-year-old. He had his whole life ahead of him, and the thought of returning home made him actually believe those words. Henry and Victor returned from a long walk in the mountains when Victor found a letter waiting for him. He had written to his father, explaining how he needed to take a break from his studies, and the man was understanding. He said he would let Victor know when a carriage would be ready for him. Victor tore open the letter with a smile, but Henry watched the joy fade as he read farther, until Victor couldn't stand. He slumped down in his chair, and the letter fluttered to the ground. Victor buried his face in his hands. His carriage would be ready in the morning. His youngest brother, William, had been murdered in the woods outside of Geneva. In the end, it was 6 years and 6 months since he had left Geneva when he finally approached the city again. Unfortunately, he had been unavoidably detained on the last leg of the trip, so Victor arrived at his town just after dark, just after the gates had been closed. He knew better than to approach. Once the gates were closed, they were closed for the night. They didn't let anyone back inside, no matter if they knew the person. Victor sighed, turned his carriage around, and made for a nearby village. As he did, though, he remembered William and felt a pang in his heart. The boy had been out after dark, too, and the gates had shut behind him. He didn't die far from where Victor rode. Victor knew the spot. It was a spot where he had slept, the times when he didn't make it back home before the gates closed. He stopped the carriage and walked into the woods. He was halfway to the spot when the rain started. He threw the cloak over his head and continued on. By the time he had reached the spot where William had died, where he had been strangled, it was a downpour punctuated by lightning strikes. As he looked on the spot where it had happened, he felt the heavy raindrops start to soak through his cloak. He sighed. William. The boy was so young. He looked out on the lake. The thunderstorm beat on like a dirge for his youngest brother. He turned back around and the lightning flashed. He froze. He wasn't the only one out there. He had seen movement in the trees not 50 meters away. Victor was still looking in that direction when lightning struck again, and he saw him. He saw it. There was no mistaking it. He would know it anywhere. He knew his creation. The thing had been standing by a tree, watching him. Lightning flashed again. It was gone. He spun around and ran to the spot where it had stood. Another lightning bolt. And he saw it scaling a cliff face. Another, and it was gone from view. Victor staggered back, lost his footing, and sunk down into the mud. How was this possible? It had died. It should have died. It escaped into a German winter with no knowledge of anything. How had it not only survived, but watched him long enough to follow him here? And then a chill came over Victor. What if it hadn't followed him here? What if it had already been here? Victor's eyes went to the spot where William had died, and he knew. His creation, that thing, was not only strong, it was smart. It figured out who Victor was. It had come to his hometown, and it had killed his brother, William Frankenstein. Justine Moritz had killed William Frankenstein. At least, that was the only thing that made sense to the city of Geneva. Victor learned this to his horror when he staggered, soaked and dirty, into the city the next morning, after roaming in the woods looking for his creation. Justine wasn't the most logical choice. She had been basically raised by the Frankensteins and had helped to raise William, but she was the only one out of the city that night when he was found. And when she was questioned, she was found to have his locket on her, the only thing the boy had of value. Everyone but Elizabeth and Victor believed it to be true, that she killed him. Elizabeth refused to believe it because she knew Justine. Victor refused to believe it because he knew his creation had done it. At the trial, Elizabeth spoke up on behalf of Justine. Victor stayed silent. Neither of them knew that the local priest warned her that if she didn't confess to the murder, she wouldn't just be executed, she'd be excommunicated, and on her death, which would come either way, she would be cast into hell. She stunned Elizabeth and Victor with her confession on the last day of her trial, and she hung on the scaffolding the next day. 2 deaths were now on Victor's hands, and he couldn't look out his window at night without thinking what could be looking back at him. He had just arrived, but he told his father and Elizabeth that he had to go. He had to take some time. They understood. They were all grieving William and Justine in their own way. Victor left the next morning for the mountains. He rode by himself through the valleys and hills. He endured cold and heat and all manner of dangers as he made his way to the mountain. In the foothills, he shooed away people wanting money to help him. He wanted to travel alone. He needed to think about his life and how, at just the age of 23, he had created one life and destroyed 2 more. He climbed and, finally, reached the peak of the mountain. The wind stung his face, and he wrapped himself tighter. On some level, the harsh, unforgiving cold felt good. It felt like what he deserved for creating something so horrid, something that was anathema to nature itself. He didn't keep track of how long he stayed up there, but it was the first time he had felt something other than unrelenting guilt since the creation of the thing. He looked on the frozen sea below, took a deep breath, and actually smiled. Victor tracked his way cautiously down the glacier and crossed the ice fields and made his way back up a hill, where he stopped to look on a wide, frozen lake. The long walk in nature had been a balm for his soul, but he knew he had to return home to the consequences of his actions. He cried out to the ice and snow, begging the wandering spirits to allow him this faint happiness, or take him away from the joys of life. He didn't believe in nature spirits, but in a way, they responded. Something caught his eye on the frozen lake below. A figure in a black, tattered, and billowing cloak, bounding over the crevices of the ice. Victor knew who, or what, it was. It had found him, alone in the wilderness, and it was coming right for him. Next week, on the season finale, we'll see what the creature has been doing for the past 4 years, and how he figured out the location of Victor's hometown, and the one demand he has for Victor to be able to live in peace. Alright, now it's time for the best of the worst. This is a segment where I talk about a ridiculous hero or villain from comics. The villain this time is Peter Merkel from DC Comics. Pete was a carnival worker in the late 1930s, and the Great Depression did what the Great Depression did. The circus was shut down, and so the contortionist, the 30-year-old and apparently triple-jointed Peter Merkel, tried to find a way to put his skill set to work, earning a living. So, of course, he dressed up like a doll, and he would fling himself into trucks, delivering toys to toy stores. He would wait for everyone to leave and crack the safe, containing, assuredly, so much Great Depression toy store money. In his doll costume, with his triple-jointedness, the name practically wrote itself. The Rag Doll was born. He did this for years, and developed a reputation in the criminal underworld. And I bet you're wondering how he developed a reputation. I mean, his whole thing was doing it in secret. Well, after each robbery, he would run away down a crowded city street with fistfuls of cash, still in his ragdoll costume. There were apparently no consequences, because toy store workers kept loading the strange man-sized doll that looked nothing like the other dolls onto the shelf. Eventually, he was contacted by the mob. They had a job for him. They boxed up the ragdoll and sent him to a wealthy heiress. The heiress received the ragdoll that was, quote, too thrilling for words. I guess it was just a really low bar for thrilling in 1942. Anyway, they took the ragdoll out of his box, lifting the man-sized doll and commenting that, wow, this is really well built. It feels like the ragdoll has real arms underneath all his stuffing. The ragdoll's powers consisted of contorting his body, and then sitting quietly in a room, waiting for everyone to leave. He hit the jackpot with the heiress heist, though, because he learned of a rich person treasure hunt. The heiress was having a party to raise money for the US in World War II. Each of the 15 people would donate 10 grand, and the heiress hid 150 grand in government bonds. To find it, they would have to go on an elaborate treasure hunt. The people playing the game were kind of not suspicious enough that they kept finding the rag doll balled up in their back seats, thinking that the heiress was just so crazy about the man-sized doll that she kept moving him from car to car. Despite the rag doll's main power being sitting motionless for long periods of time, his main adversary was the Flash, the guy who can run super fast. A lot of stuff happened, but he got the jump on Flash, who I guess didn't realize a large rag doll hanging out in an aquarium was weird. Rag doll knocked the hero out and tossed him into a vat with a giant octopus. One fight with a giant octopus later, and the Flash was tackling the rag doll and tying him up with his own arms. The rag doll had an inexplicably long criminal career, and somehow fought the Flash several times, though I personally don't get that. If a giant doll ever tosses me into a vat to fight an octopus, I'm going to be on the lookout for giant dolls for the rest of my life. Eventually, when Peter Merkel, the rag doll, was in his 70s in the 1980s, rag doll's mind and body both started to go. He just sat on a street corner and ranted about stuff. So, of course, he attracted other homeless people to him and started a cult. As we all know, 1940 circuses taught hypnosis well enough to control an army of homeless people and bathe the city in blood and fire for a summer. It was the rag doll's last stand, though, and he was killed by an explosion. He was reimagined years later with a scary exterior, like the Scarecrow from Batman, though that really undercuts one of his two powers. He can still contort, but he can't trick people, because if you see a giant menacing-looking guy just sitting in a corner, you're not going to assume it's a doll. You're going to assume it's a psychopath dressed like a scarecrow. Though I suppose he had to do something. I mean, with toy stores declining, nowadays he'd probably have to sneak into an Amazon warehouse or something. But then he'd probably die there, because no one is ordering creepy man-sized rag dolls. That's it for this week. Today's episode was written by me, Jason Weiser, and edited by Carissa Weiser. Our theme song is by the amazing Breakmaster Cylinder. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.